He's writing about the creative process in music. Most people want to know how things are made. They frankly admit, however, that they feel completely at sea when it comes to understanding how a piece of music is made, where a composer begins, how he manages to keep going, in fact, how and where he learns his trade, all are shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The composer, in short, is a man of mystery, or woman, of mystery to most people, and the composer's workshop, an unapproachable ivory tower. That describes Sunnytown, doesn't it? Looking around the room, I think not. One of the first things most people want to hear discussed in relation to composing is the question of inspiration. They find it difficult to believe that composers are not as preoccupied with that question as they had supposed. The layman always finds it hard to realize how natural it is for the composer to compose. He has a tendency to put himself into the position of the composer and to visualize the problems involved, including that of inspiration, from the perspective of the layman. He forgets that composing to a composer is like fulfilling a natural function. It's like eating or sleeping. It's something that the composer happens to have been born to do, and because of that, it loses the character of a special virtue in the composer's eyes. The composer, therefore, confronted with the question of inspiration, does not say to himself, "Do I feel inspired?" He says to himself, "Do I feel like composing today?" And if he feels like composing, he does. It's more or less like saying to yourself, "Do I feel sleepy?" If you feel sleepy, you go to sleep. If you don't feel sleepy, you stay up. If the composer doesn't feel like composing, he doesn't compose. It's as simple as that. Of course, after you've finished composing, you hope that everyone, including yourself, will recognize the thing you have written as having been inspired. But that's really an idea tacked on at the end. And the second piece I've chosen shows his openness, really, and his enthusiasm for new developments, although, of course, a very sound classical musician, and particularly jazz. And in the chapter where he talks about tone color, he talks about the 4 types of instruments: the strings, the woodwind, the brass, and the percussion. And I'll pick out 2 instruments and then the final chapter here. With the strings, the last of the string family, the double bass, is the largest of all and must be played standing. Because it is seen in jazz bands, it has recently taken on an importance more nearly commensurate with its size. When it was first used in orchestras, it played a very menial role, doing little more than what the cello did, doubling the bass, as it's called, an octave lower. This it does very well. Later composers gave it a part of its own to play down in the depths of the orchestra. It almost never functions as a solo instrument, and if you've ever heard a double bass trying to sing a melody, you will understand why. I speak as a bass player. The proper function of the double bass is to supply a firm foundation for the entire structure above it. And then concluding the woodwind section, recently a new instrument has been added, which is partly a woodwind, called the saxophone. You've probably heard of it. At first it was only very sparingly used in the usual symphonic orchestra. Then suddenly the jazz band began exploiting it, and now it's finding its way back to more extended use in the symphonic field. I just love that openness. And he concludes the chapter. A chapter on tone color written in America would be incomplete without some mention of the jazz band, our own original contribution to new orchestral timbres. The jazz band is a real creation in novel tonal effects, whether you like them or not. It's the absence of strings and the resultant dependence on brass and wind as melody instruments that makes the modern dance band so different from a Viennese waltz orchestra. If you listen to a jazz band closely, you'll discover that certain instruments provide the rhythmic background, the piano, banjo, bass, and percussion. Others the harmonic texture, with, as a rule, one solo instrument playing the melody. Trumpet, clarinet, saxophone, and trombone are used interchangeably as harmonic or melodic instruments. The real fun begins when the melody is counterpointed by one or more subsidiary ones, making for an intricacy of melodic and rhythmic elements that only the closest listening can unravel. There's no reason why you should not use the jazz band as a way of practicing how mentally to disconnect separate musical elements. When the band is at its best, it will set you problems aplenty.